Hello, I'm Kim Jian in Seoul. Countries that were heavily reliant on free flow of goods were abruptly hit hard by the pandemic-induced global supply chain disruption. So for this edition of The Point, we take a look into the future of trade in an era where the promotion of free and fair trade is increasingly becoming difficult.
U.S. Trade Representative Katherine Tai visited South Korea ahead of the 10th anniversary of the two countries' free trade agreement slated for March next year. Her visit marks the first time a top U.S. trade official had visited South Korea.
Korea is one of our most valued trading partners and one of our closest allies. The KORUS FTA continues to be both a reflection of that close relationship and the foundation.
The two allies agreed to establish a new dialogue channel to effectively respond to challenges arising from global trade.
I hope to see the joint committee develop into a valuable platform for stronger partnership to address global challenges, including supply chains, technologies, climate change, vaccines, and a new digital trade framework.
The international community has been hit hard by the global supply chain disruption. Uneven global distribution of vaccines, supply shortage of semiconductors, magnesium in Europe, and urea water solution in South Korea. The global supply chain disruption was brought on by the pandemic and has been overlapped with other issues, including countries' divide over climate change and growing rivalry between the US and China. Although some point to signs of gradual easing of global supply chain disruption, a plethora of challenges still lie ahead. Meanwhile, the World Trade Organization is facing intense scrutiny over its legitimacy in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic and US-China trade spat. What strategies should South Korea adopt in the state of play of convoluted trade tug-of-war?
Today's discussion on the future of trade comes as member countries of the World Trade Organization are about to hold a ministerial forum for the first time since 2017. The 12th WTO Ministerial Conference will take place in Geneva from November 30th. This meeting comes as U.S. Trade Representative Katherine Tai wrapped up her three-nation tour with partners in the Indo-Pacific this week. She met up with her counterparts in Japan, South Korea, and India. We have one of them in the studio. I invite South Korea's Trade Minister Yeo-hangu, who's on my right. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
And from the U.S. via Zoom, we're joined by Ms. Nikolkollin's, President of International Trade and Government Relations at Sandler, Travis and Rosenberg Professional Association. Welcome to the show, President Collinson.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
I'll start with you, Minister Yeo. U.S.-China rivalry has somewhat contributed to the global supply chain crisis. And to counter China's Belt and Road Initiative, the U.S. plans to launch a big infrastructure projects worldwide. So what is Korea's strategy, given that it's a strong alliance with the U.S., but the country has strong ties with China in terms of economy and geopolitics?
Thank you for the question. It's an excellent question. The United States and China are two important partners for Korea. The United States is an ironclad military alliance with Korea. And with the United States, we share common values such as democracy, market capitalism, human rights, and then rule-based international law and rule of law. So I think that was reflected very well during this successful May summit between President Moon and President Biden. China is also the number one trading partner with Korea, which comprises about 25% of total trade volume with Korea. Also, historically and also economically and culturally, Korea and China have been very close neighboring countries for a long, long time. So I think it's worth noting that Korea is not the only country to face this dilemma. In fact, most nations in the Asia Pacific find themselves in a similar situation as Korea, because between these two great powers. So I think it is important for like-minded countries, including Korea, to collaborate with each other and then find ways in which all these countries can coexist, with these two great power. And also, it's worth noting that U.S. Vice President Kamala Harris, on a visit to Singapore, stated that the United States doesn't intend to exclude any one country, nor want the allies to choose between countries. So.
All right, we'll talk about more of the multilateral cooperation that you just mentioned later in the program. But first, USTR Thai called for worker-centric policies during her two-day trip to India this week. In a rare move, she also met with South Korea's labor minister during her trip to the country a week ago. So given all this, Ms. Collinson, does this signal a fundamental shift in U.S. economic and trade framework in the Asian region that could be focused on worker-centric policies? And if so, what's the reason behind this new emphasis?
Well, thank you. That's a very good question. And it is significant that USTR Thai met with their labor minister. It's a signal and a carrying forward of what's going on and reflected of what's happening here in the United States. The Biden administration has taken a very strong pro-U.S. worker position, and they're looking at their trading relationships through that same lens, focusing it on the worker and on the domestic work in that country. They've been looking at the living wages, protection from corporate exploitation, and they're extending these same type of rights, or trying to get these same type of rights extended to workers around the world. They want to ensure that any relationships or trading relationships or trade agreements focus on these elements as well, not just on reducing tariffs or reducing other barriers, but also focus on the working conditions to make it a level playing field and to bring all of the workers up to the same level. I think that the U.S., regardless of wherever they're working, whether it's a worker in South Korea, it's a worker in India, it's a worker in any other Indo-Pacific country, they want to assure that the corporations and the government structures behind it are supporting policies that take care of the workers. We've seen during this pandemic that there were some countries which don't have safety nets for the workers. As soon as the corporations shut down because of the COVID, there was no place for these workers to go. They didn't have health insurance. They didn't have support systems. They didn't have any type of what we have, Social Security here in the U.S. And so they were left abandoned. And one of the issues is that responsibility cannot rest solely and entirely on the fate of corporations. They are not nation state builders. And so partnering with our allies and with other countries to ensure that we all have the same idea of how the workers should be treated and what the conditions should be, I think is what they're focusing on. And again, it's an extension of what they're trying to do here in the United States.
Well, as the world suffers from the pandemic-induced global supply chain, countries that have relied on trade for growth had to find alternatives despite heavy risks to its economy and business. So, Minister, what's South Korea's strategy to weather this current supply chain storm, with this in mind that in 2022, U.S. and South Korea will mark the 10th anniversary of its bilateral free trade agreement?
Yes, supply chain resilience is a buzzword around the world these days. But if you look at how this global supply chain has evolved over decades of time to the current form of what we see today, is that number one principle in those global supply chain was efficiency. Yeah, but nowadays, with all the supply chain disruption, now countries and companies begin to think that maybe the efficiency is not the only important factor. Maybe resilience and stability and sustainability of supply chain could be more critical as we see these days. And also, it's important to know that no single country can own the whole the supply chain, as you can see in the semiconductor and battery and the electric vehicle. And that's why it is very important for this like-minded country to divide the division of play a role in the right division of labor, capital, and technology. And in case of Korea, Korean companies are very well positioned to play a key role in this critical supply chain as semiconductor and battery and electric vehicle. So as you mentioned at the beginning, the USTR Ambassador Catherine Tai came to Korea last week, and we had a very productive meeting. And we recognize the importance of Korea-US collaboration in strengthening the supply chain cooperation. And also, we agreed to initiate new approach through enhanced channel of communication to effectively address those supply chain challenges, emerging technology, and digital trade, etc.
Well, one of the biggest reasons for the urea solution shortage crisis in South Korea comes from the fact that the country is heavily dependent on imports of key materials. In fact, the number of its imports that are on shaky global supply routes are currently estimated at 4,000, according to the Korea International Trade Association, indicating a crisis of this scale may not be its last. So other than diversifying trade routes, Minister Yo, what efforts should be made to ensure that this crisis will not happen in South Korea in the future?
Yeah, we have previous experience of successfully turning the supply chain disruption crisis into opportunity when faced with a sudden export control imposed by Japan in 2019. And with the urea shortage crisis, we learned another important lesson. It is not just the high-tech, this raw material that matters. Also, this commodity raw material could be also very important in the supply chain management. So now the Korean government is really developing new strategy, more comprehensive and systematic supply chain management strategy. There are, I think, two elements. First, we are trying to identify these key raw materials and commodity material which could be vulnerable to this possible supply chain risk. And then if it is too dependent on one country, or there's the supply and demand instability, or it is closely related to just daily lives of average citizen. So we are in the process of identifying those key raw materials. And secondly, the government is exploring all the policy options that we can mitigate the supply chain risk. As you mentioned, diversifying the supply chain routes and the sources is one way of doing it, but also building up stockpile, domestically, or helping domestic companies to, produce those the raw materials inside Korea. So we are exploring all these options nowadays.
Okay. Well, amid a rivalry over tech between China and the U.S. has requested foreign chip manufacturers in its country to submit related documents to its authorities. The move is part of efforts to get to the bottom of the global shortage of semiconductors. So, Minister Yu, can you explain to us further about this issue and what's the government doing to resolve this steel issue and the semiconductor issue?
Yes. I understand that the U.S. government is trying to address the shortage of automobile semiconductor by enhancing the transparency in the supply chain, and then trying to narrow the information gap between supply and demand. But as a consequence, there's a serious concern arising from the government and the businesses, including Korea, that it might expose or reveal sensitive business information or confidential customer or technology information. So from the outset, the Korean government has raised serious concern to our U.S. counterpart. And then we understand that the U.S. government is well aware of the Korea's concern from the government as well as from the business side. So, and also we repeatedly emphasize that this measure needs to be a one-off measure. So we hope that this could be resolved in a peaceful manner.
I mean, the South Korea and U.S. are to convene a director-level dialogue on semiconductors this December. So this new channel could be a solution to this semiconductor issue. So Samsung Electronics Vice Chairman Lee Jae-yong confirmed a $17 billion project to build the next generation foundry production in Taylor, U.S. state of Texas during his visit to the country this week. So Ms. Collinson, the latest move, will it help solve the current conundrum regarding the supply chain for chips? And how does this address the U.S. focus on domestic production or nearshoring production?
So I would agree with some of the points that Minister Yo said. The United States is undertaking the same type of exercise as Korea, looking at our supply chain, looking at the critical supply elements and determining which of those do we have an over-reliance on a single provider, or is there the ability to shift that provider to one of our closer allies. So that exercise is going on. The Biden administration put out a report, and I think if you look at that, it gives you an idea of some of the direction that we're probably going to be heading. Now, I know the buzzwords that are used by this administration talk about reshoring and nearshoring. I honestly think that in many instances, using the word reshoring is a misnomer because a lot of the technology was not developed in the United States on some of these products, like these semiconductor chips. This was developed technology in South Korea and in other countries. And that technology never existed in the United States. So the idea of having Samsung come into the US to build the chips here, I think is probably one of the best ways for the United States to help shore up its supply in these chains, and also to get some of the technology into the United States that we just didn't have before. It may have been developed here in the United States, or it may have been developed in coordination with some of our partners, but the actual manufacturing didn't occur here. I think this is going to be important for moving the U.S. forward in identifying other areas where, we see that the best way to sometimes deal with the U.S. market, which is huge and it's a big global consumer, is to locate that manufacturing into the United States. I mean, South Korea has been very focused on this many years, whether it's with respect to automobiles manufacturers with Kia and Hyundai and others, or whether it's with respect to washing machines and dryers with LG and Samsung as well. I think that it gives you an indication of the tight partnership, not only geopolitical, but also from a business and economic perspective of our two nations. And I think that that's something that the United States is looking for, are those kinds of partners who are willing to share the technology, trusting that their intellectual property will be protected while it is in the United States.
Well, in terms of semiconductors, the tightening of relations between the two countries is evident, but I'll move on to more contentious issues between the two countries. Other than semiconductors, steel comprises a lot of South Korea's exports are regulated by U.S. Trade Expansion Act of 1962, a long-standing issue between the two countries, and was also on the agenda during your meeting with Thai. So, Minister Yo, what is South Korea's strategy regarding the steel issue?
Yeah, steel is a very important industry to Korea. And during the Trump administration in 2018, Korea and United States reached an agreement on the steel arrangement of 70% quota, this 3-year average, along with this Chorus FTA amendment. And now things have changed since then, because recently the United States announced an agreement with European Union for more flexible this steel arrangement. And also United States announced the new initiation of this the steel negotiation with United Kingdom and Japan. So I think it is fair and timely for United States and Korea to revisit and reopen this current steel arrangement. Into more flexible regime. So, to our counterpart, the Department of Commerce and also USTR, we strongly raised this issue and then requested the US and Korea begin this new revisiting this steel arrangement as soon as possible.
Okay, that's a Good start. Well, in the wake of the pandemic, the rules of the World Trade Organization on intellectual property rights became formidable barriers for equitable access to COVID-19 vaccines. Now, breaking ranks of developing countries, the Biden administration has lended limited support by making vaccines and medicines more affordable and accessible to developing countries. So, Ms. Collinson, do you think many parts of the developing countries will be disappointed yet again in not seeing any significant forward movement to waive IPRs regarding vaccines?
Well, this is a very difficult issue, as I'm sure you can imagine. And I would note that the United States has signaled that it's willing to waive the IPR protections. I believe right now it's the EU that is being the holdup. However, there are countries who are objecting to the lack of leadership, should we say, of the United States in pushing other countries to try to assume and agree that the IPR should be waived in this instance because it is a global pandemic. But again, as I'm sure many South Korean companies can also agree, there is protection needed for the development of their intellectual property. There's probably some compromise that can be reached. I believe that that the WTO and the countries can work together to find either sharing of research, working jointly, pulling together. I think there is an opportunity for this, and we should look to see that happen at the WTO. I'm not sure that we're going to see a complete waiver, but as I said, I think there is some abbreviation or some way to work where the countries work together.
Right.
And hopefully they'll continue to do that because I don't believe this is our last pandemic. And I think if we set up some sort of protocol now for this type of arrangement among WTO members, we'll be better positioned to deal with it globally next time.
Right, and the establishment of a global vaccine hub was one of the key agendas that you were visiting in the United States and Europe earlier this year. So, Minister Yeo, how important is South Korea's role regarding COVID-19 vaccine distribution and production in other countries?
Korea is world's number 2 biopharm production base. And also, Korea produced 4 kinds of COVID-19 vaccines already. The AstraZeneca, Novavax, the Moderna, and the Sputnik. So we have this, the production capacity we can contribute to the world. And one of the successful outcomes from the May summit between Korea and the United States was the agreement of Korea-US Global Vaccine Production Hub. The idea is that United States has this mRNA high technology, and Korea has this production capacity. If we combine these the merit of 2 countries, we can not only help these 2 countries but also help these countries and people around the world in need. So that's where I think Korea can add value by helping scaling up this production of vaccine to be provided and distributed to the people around the world.
And that would contribute to resolving the global supply chain crisis as
Yes,
well.
yeah.
Well, South Korea also plans to decide whether to join the CPTPP, a renegotiated version of the TPP. So is South Korea considering deciding to join the CPTPP as well?
Yeah, the CPTPP Korea has been considering for this TPP accession for the last 8 years. And from early this year, we have been accelerating this preparation process. I think there's a lot for Korea to offer to CPTPP. Korea is highly industrialized and the cutting edge technology leader. So by adding Korea into the CPTPP, this CPTPP can develop into more inclusive, comprehensive, transparent the platform in the Asia Pacific. So I think Korea hasn't decided yet, but we will continue to consider and prepare for this accession into CPTPP.
All right, I guess other countries will be crossing their fingers to see whether South Korea is going to join this mega hit free trade agreement with 11 nations in the Asian Pacific.
Yes.
All right, Minister Yeo and President Collinson, thanks for sharing your insights with us. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Throughout this edition, we've delved into the future of trade. You can follow all of our stories on the Arirang website or YouTube channel. That's it for The Point. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.